That's on.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Russell Armstrong, and I'm here on behalf of the U.S. Climate Action Network, the largest civil society network in the United States, made up of 190 organizations. We're here to talk about climate finance. As you all know, 2024 is going to be the hottest year on record. We have wildfires in New Jersey and New York. We have droughts across the U.S. We have tornadoes at a record pace right now. The global north is not immune to the impacts and effects of climate change. That is why it is of the utmost importance that at this COP, we deliver on real climate finance, not just for the global south, but for all communities. We're here today to explain why climate finance is important, and that it does not matter whether there's a climate denier in the office of the presidency for the United States, because the climate and the weather does not care who the president is. The fellow panelists here are going to explain to you the need for climate finance, for significant climate finance, and why the US and other developed countries should care and need and must care about delivering real finance that is not just based on false solutions. First, I'm going to pass it to my colleague Brandon Wu to explain how the money should be delivered and what is necessary.
Thank you, Russell. I want to start by actually just stating the obvious, which is that climate change doesn't care about national borders, which means that we cannot protect communities in the United States without a global solution to the climate crisis. And a global solution means transitions to cleaner, more sustainable economies around the world, and it's impossible to do that without a massive redistribution of resources. And that's what climate finance is. It's redistribution, money flowing from the global north to the global south to support climate action in countries that have done very little to cause the crisis. It's actually very simple. Developed countries are trying to make it complicated. It's an intentional strategy so that they can distract from the fact that they've failed to deliver on their climate finance obligations for decades now. And if they had provided the money that they themselves have promised, these negotiations would actually be much easier across all the different negotiating tracks. Now, the US, as the world's largest historical emitter and one of the richest countries in the world, has a unique responsibility to both cut our emissions as fast as possible and to provide our fair share of climate finance, public grant-based finance, to countries in the global south that have done little to cause the problem. Here at COP29, developing countries are asking for $1.3 trillion a year as a global target in the NCQG negotiations, of which at least $600 billion should be public and grant-based. That sounds like a lot, but our analysis has shown that modest increases in tax to GDP ratios in developed countries can raise $2 trillion a year. And outside of the realm of the theoretical, the US finds billions of dollars on a regular basis to support wars. Our military budget is nearing $1 trillion every year. And more constructively, our Congress found $2 trillion a year in 2020 and 2021 to deal with the COVID crisis. So if we decide that a problem is worth solving, we can find the money to solve it. Unfortunately, we have centuries of history to show that threats to the lives and livelihoods of poor, black, brown, vulnerable people in our country and abroad are not a problem that we as a country deem worth solving. So it's no wonder, given that history, that we are still living, that these negotiations aren't going well. We really need a radical reversal in our government's capacity to care for people and to stand in solidarity with the rest of the world rather than pretending that we're somehow above it. Redistribution of resources at home has to be accompanied by paying our fair share of climate finance internationally. It's the right thing to do ethically, and it's the only thing that is going to construct a better world for everyone on this planet. Now, I want to close by saying that it might seem like an odd time to be thinking about a radical shift in US government policy towards care and solidarity. But the Biden administration knows that it has to do as much as it can to limit the damage that the next administration is going to do. And it can start here by agreeing to an ambitious global climate finance target instead of standing in the way, instead of insisting that profit-seeking private investment rather than the redistribution of resources is the answer. Thank you.
Next, I'm going to pass it to Liddy with the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development.
Thank you. I'm not from the United States, I'm from the Philippines, but I'm here to also echo and perhaps even put it in a stronger way, the message that what we want to deliver today. As people from the Global South, we've actually been demanding that the Global North governments deliver at least $5 trillion a year, which is roughly what we calculate to be the smallest estimate of all the total costs of climate action in the South. That includes mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and the cost of making sure the transitions will be just and equitable. But of course, knowing that it's a huge, huge jump from $100 billion a year, which was the pledge in 2009, which today has not even been met, to a $5 trillion, we have been telling ourselves we will settle for at least trillions and not billions. And we are happy that the governments of the South, as represented by the G77 plus China, have actually settled on a number that was far more ambitious than what they were considering earlier. So the demand of the G77 is 1.3 trillion. We know that this money is not just about the needs and the interests of people from the Global South. We are here to reiterate our plea for our governments, both in the North and in the South, to stand up for our rights, especially governments in the South, for us, for our people, to stand up for our rights, and that this climate finance, as a reminder, is not just to ensure that we address the needs of people of the Global South for adaptation, resilience building, loss and damage, but that this address the needs for the kind of major climate actions that we need to do in the South so that the entire planet can be saved from climate catastrophe. Climate action that is about reducing carbon emissions to zero by 2050 will not succeed unless everyone does it, unless we also in the Global South undertake very major, ambitious mitigation actions, but we will not be able to do it without that climate finance, not because we don't want to, but because objectively there's not enough resources in the South. We have been bleeding. There has been a net outflow of resources from the South to the North historically for many, many years since the history of colonization, and it continues today to about $2 trillion of net outflow from the South to the North. We will not have those resources needed for us to do the actions that is required by the entire planet, by all of humanity. And it is owed to us that this action be financed by the Global North because it does carry much of the historical responsibility why we are in this crisis today. So we are urging, not just in behalf of our people, but in behalf of all peoples of the world, especially all of the vulnerable communities, those who are struggling in the front lines, and we find that both in the North as well as in the South, that there are communities who are already suffering devastating impacts of climate, that the US and other countries, rich countries, other governments of rich countries deliver on their climate finance obligations. Trillions and not billions, and public finance. That's my last point. We really need to emphasize that public finance is very vital. It's very key. Many changes in this world have to be led by governments. We cannot wait for the private sector and the markets to do these actions, and in the name of the interest for profits and revenues, for their own revenues. We need our governments to lead in this process, and public finance is needed. Private finance is needed, of course, but public finance is so vital and so key. We are not here to beg. We are here to point out that these governments of the rich countries owe it to the rest of humanity to deliver on their obligations. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, speaking about the connection between impacted peoples, I'm going to pass it to Colette Pichon-Battle, who is not only the founder of Taproot, but also on the board of CAN.
Thank you so much, Russell. Good morning, everyone. Taproot Earth is a climate justice organization headquartered in the Gulf South in the United States. I'm from the great state of Louisiana, and we are born out of almost 20 years of hurricane recovery since Hurricane Katrina. Our work is to facilitate and cultivate frontline solutions in the Gulf South and Appalachia. These formations that we anchor in the United States are in the spaces that have the worst health outcomes, the lowest household incomes. We also have the greatest number of toxic facilities, and most of our people live somewhere very close to these spaces. This conversation around climate justice is not just about the invisible emissions and future impact. It is about the emissions that have been accompanying pollution in our communities and are having an impact around the planet right now. Louisiana in particular has 3 times the amount of industrial emissions of any state in the United States. And this is part of a broader narrative and conversation of what the global North owes to the global South. It's an interesting conversation around vulnerable communities because we have to remember that vulnerability has been created. Communities do not start off vulnerable. This is part of a very long extractive process by colonizing nations that began with the extraction of people, the extraction of natural resources, and continues with the extraction of fossil fuels. The emissions are accelerating the global climate imbalance. The opportunity at COP29 is for the global North to begin a process of repair that should start with $1.3 trillion, but should not end there. I agree with Liddy's point. This $5 trillion that has been asked for and has been ratcheted down and pushed down, we're forcing the global South to beg for its life, and this is not just unfair, it is not lawful. I believe there are countries of the global North who are trying to escape liability when this is a moment when we have an opportunity to be accountable to the world, and we have a moment to be the best humans that we can be, but it is going to require all of the global North countries to admit the truth. We are responsible for the imbalance that the globe is feeling right now, and we have a responsibility and an opportunity in this moment to go forward. The wealth that we are talking about, these rich nations, has also been created, stolen, if we want to be honest about it. And that wealth has to be redistributed now so that folks can defend themselves and prepare for an uncertain future that we all know is coming. There's a moment here at COP29, and the global North cannot skip on this moment. They have to be accountable. We have to have climate finance for the people. We need to start at least 1.3 trillion, and we don't need to go back from that.
Next, I'm going to pass it to Felicia, who's going to, from the Sunrise Movement, who's going to also speak to some of the impacts that are happening in the United States and the need for having finance across the world and how we're akin to the same challenges that are happening in other parts of the global South.
Thank you so much. I am a youth organizer in North Carolina, and we were just hit by Hurricane Helene not even 2 months ago on September 27th. Ironically, at the time, I was working on an energy justice poster for the North Carolina Environmental Justice Summit, 2 weeks after the hurricane had hit. And I was working on it with a fellow organizer, Sophie, who is based in Western North Carolina, where the hurricane hit the most. And while we were making this poster, I couldn't reach her at all. I tried calling her, emailing her, texting her, but she had no service, she had no power, and she was living out of her car for basically 2 weeks up until the summit. And during this time, she would try to go to coffee shops, other conference centers for environmental conferences, etc., to get Wi-Fi, just so we could work on energy justice together. And we showed up at the Environmental Justice Summit, presented the poster, and educated frontline communities in North Carolina about how they could advocate for more affordable, reliable, and accessible energy. And throughout this entire process, Sophie didn't have access to energy herself. And these are the people that we need to support. I know tons of activists, organizers, volunteers in North Carolina that are doing everything they can to support their communities in face of climate disasters. But the problem is we don't have the resources, even in the American South, let alone the global South. We need to pay and finance and support all of these incredible people, especially youth, that are working throughout the world on climate solutions. And I will just add one more point, is that I am sick of people saying that it's up to the youth to fix this, because it is up to all of us. And also, it is really unfair to put the burden on the youth. I mean, I'm still in school. I go back every night from COP and I have to do my homework. It is crazy to expect the youth to solve this problem for us. So we need to pay up, resource our youth, finance solutions throughout the American and global South so that we can actually mitigate, adapt to, and respond to the damages of the climate crisis.
Thank you. To close this out before we offer up for questions, I just want to add that right now, many of the world's leaders are in Brazil talking at the G20, talking about a variety of things. Yet they're not talking enough about the need to actually deliver on climate finance. It is important that they talk about this money because it is a solution to solving the climate crisis. You can't have things, you can't figure out the technologies, the early warning systems, the way to adapt, mitigate, and provide recompense for the damages done without having significant and appropriate funding for those damages. The time is now. It is not for polluters. This is not a global challenge that should be spread out across the global South. It is not the responsibility of the global South. Polluters must pay first, and that's what we are calling for to happen. $1 trillion is just the down payment on making sure that we have enough to support an actual future that doesn't leave the world burning. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Mike Phillips with the Associated Press. We've obviously seen a retreat on climate action from the United States and from Argentina. At the same time, that does not mean that conservative and right-wing governments have done the same thing around the world. We've seen different kinds of actions in Italy, Poland, and Hungary. I'm curious if you have any insight into why we've seen this divide between the ways that these types of governments have acted on this issue.
So just to clarify, you're asking about the difference between right-wing and, I guess, center or moderate governments in terms of their approaches?
Yeah, so the different approaches in the US and Argentina versus some of the European governments that are right-wing that have taken a different approach. We had Hungary stand up at COP talking about the need for climate action, but we have not had that in the United States, for example.
You want to take that?
We have a right-wing government in the Philippines, and they're not retreating from climate change actions. And I think it's a good thing that being right doesn't always automatically mean being a climate denier. I think there are many governments across the world that are paying enough attention to science. I don't know why Trump is the way he is, but it's not paying attention, they're paying enough attention to science so that they're not denying what is happening. Of course, it doesn't mean that they're acting adequately with enough urgency, but at least they're not pulling out of these negotiations or the Paris Agreement. So just pointing that out. Thank you. And I'm sorry I have to rush to another thing. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we should rethink that question and the reality of that question. I think when we see global north countries pull out of collective conversations, we're not seeing denial, we're seeing obstruction. And we're watching countries take the time and take the space to figure out how to privatize and commodify this reality. I don't think we're seeing deniers. We're seeing deep investment in the privatization of water. We're seeing deep investment in the privatization of electricity. We're seeing deep investment in people's ability to be resilient in the face of disasters with 2 and 3 homes. We're not seeing climate denial. We're seeing a domination and a supremacy that is permeating throughout the globe. I think we should be careful with who we say are deniers, because they usually point to the poor people who don't understand the science or they can't connect the dots or whatever. But what we're seeing at the top levels of our leadership is not a sense of denial. We're seeing deep investment in understanding and positioning on how to figure out how to stay on top in a new climate reality.
I'm a youth climate activist from the Global South, and I had 2 questions. So within the US, I was following the hurricanes in North Carolina, and I was so surprised that the victims only received $750, and it was given to them as loans. And so how do we expect from the US and similar countries to give money to the Global South when they couldn't even give money to their own people who were victims of the hurricanes in North Carolina recently? And then my other question is, in the wake of the US elections, Trump has been very vocal about sort of cutting down the budget from a lot of wars that are ongoing, like Ukraine, etc. And so is it correct or valid to be hopeful that some of that money that is not directed to war would be instead directed to climate projects or environmental friendly, or to climate finance?
Okay. I heard your first question, but not the second. So I could answer that, but Felicia could also answer. Go ahead.
In terms of the first question, I think it's a complicated issue. I mean, as Brandon has said, the financing is available. It's about whether or not we have the political willpower to activate that financing. And for North Carolina specifically, and I think the US in general, it's a problem of regulatory capture. It's a problem of money. It's a problem of unfair campaign finance and political finance from companies. For example, in North Carolina, we were unable to access, I believe, $70 million in FEMA funding because of our lack of stringent building codes. And that is a problem because of our business associations and lobbyists. So yeah, that's my very, because I'm a local and state organizer, that's my very hyper-specific to North Carolina answer.
Yeah, and also to that point, I would like to say that while it was bad, that's an example of what happened when you don't have early warning systems, when you don't have the ability to look at what's going to happen with hurricanes and the movement, and that people don't believe and lose trust in terms of like what the government is going to say. It was not an issue of money when it came to like hurricane relief in North Carolina. It was an issue of trust and willingness to move. And that's why the United States sees this themselves, and the fact that these communities across the South and Appalachia experience the same things in the global South. It should not be unclear to our government what the need is. And so that's why we're calling on our own government to ensure that they're providing climate finance. I want to make sure we get to some more questions. I know you. Oh.
Hello, this is Rimsha Rehan, and I'm representing Pakistan here. I really appreciate the conversation here, and especially that you're taking responsibility, the Global North is taking responsibility of the imbalance that has been faced between the Global North and Global South. But my question here is that is responsibility only enough in this time when the climate crisis is here? Because coming from Pakistan, who is facing extreme climate crisis, and we are contributing less than 1% for the greenhouse emissions. So how is the Global North making the process of financing more inclusive in terms of involving communities, the direct affectees, such as the one that are affected by the climate crisis in Pakistan, such as the coal mining processes in the 3rd district, as well as other impacts from the floods that were caused in 2022. So how is the, making this process of climate financing more inclusive, especially under the NCQG? And what we also see is that just taking responsibility, like I said, is not enough, because at one part, the Global North is also financing coal power plants, fossil fuel power plants through the MDBs in Global South countries. So we see there is a disparity between the actions and the words. So if you can provide more clarity on that. Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, I think we should be clear. The words you're hearing us say are very different from the words that our government says, right? And so the answer to your question, what is the United States doing to facilitate all the things you mentioned, is nothing. In fact, we're doing the opposite of all of that, right? Our government is actively making things worse in the NCQG negotiation. We're actively trying to make climate finance less inclusive. One of the things we fought for as civil society was the Green Climate Fund, because it's a democratically governed fund where developing countries have an equal say in how the money is distributed. The US signed up to the GCF and then sent a little bit of money over, and then decided to send a whole lot of money through the World Bank for its climate finance obligations, because it can control how the money is spent when it goes through the World Bank. So the US is actively undermining processes that we have fought for and that we have won to make climate finance more inclusive and more responsive to the needs of communities. And what you're hearing up here are people within the United States who are trying to push back against that, and we have our work cut out for us.
All right, well, to wrap up, we'll be available for any questions afterwards if someone wants to come speak to us. I just want to say again that the fossil fuel industry had $4 trillion in revenues last year. We are asking for is not overwhelming, it is not ridiculous, it is not like crazy as some folks have said before. This is actually a reasonable amount of funding to solve the climate crisis before it is unsolvable and we end up like the dinosaurs. The earth will still be here, but we will not be. And so it is the charge of the people who are the historic emitters to make sure that there's funding for the rest of the world before we all feel the impacts of climate change. Thank you.